if we haven't met. If this is your first time, I just want to welcome you. And if it is your first time, we're in kind of this in-between space right now in terms of what our weekly messages are, because we just finished a series called Zoe. And this was a series on, what it means to live a full, meaningful life. So that just ended. And then, in a couple of weeks, I'm not sure if you're aware or you've heard, but in a couple of weeks, there's a pretty big election happening. Does anyone know about, anyone kind of knew about this? Yeah. I don't know. It's kind of under the radar this year, but of course, that's something that we're going to approach and talk about as a community, both before and after Election Day. So that's coming up. But before we get there, we're kind of in this really cool in-between liminal space, and I wanted to use this time as an opportunity to talk about something that's very dear to my heart and very integral to this community. But it's something that we haven't actually spent a Sunday exploring and defining together, and that is the concept of interfaith. Because as a community, we are a space where people of diverse backgrounds, spiritual experiences, faith traditions come together, learn from each other, are open-minded towards experiences that might be very unfamiliar, and really valuing and cherishing that for all the depth it adds to our lives, rather than focusing on what makes us different. Right? So that is a core and integral part of what it means to be in a community like this. But it's also something that we haven't just sat and spent a Sunday talking about what not only that means for us, but that might mean for the world and the expansion of kind of our sense of unity, compassion, and brotherly, sisterly love to the entire planet, right? And so really this conversation on what it means to be interfaith and to have interfaith dialogue is really a conversation about expanding circles of compassion, care, and empathy in our lives and in our world. But in order to talk about expanding circles, we need to talk about fruit. And in order to talk about fruit, we're going to talk about humanity. But we're going to go through Sabino Canyon to talk about humanity. Along the way, we're going to get some clay pots. We need to talk about the mystics in order to get to those clay pots. Before that, we got to talk about food courts because, who doesn't love food courts? But we got to go through ancient religion. To get there, we need to take a quick detour through Times Square. Before that, we're going to talk a little bit about soup. Before soup, we need to, of course, talk about bumper stickers. But before that, we need to define the word interfaith. So this is sort of the set list for today. Does that sound okay? All right. Today's message is called Our Interfaith Future. And I want to be really clear what I'm talking about when I use the word interfaith. And so to define this word, I wanted to turn to what I feel is one of the more broad, comprehensive definitions of this word and of what interfaith dialogue and communication and relationship can look like. And so I'm turning to the United Nations, because when they think about interfaith, they think about it in really broad geopolitical terms. And they have this wonderful definition. And it goes like this. Interfaith dialogue is the cooperative, constructive, and positive interaction between people of different religious traditions, i.e. faiths, and or spiritual or humanistic beliefs at both the individual and institutional levels. How does that sound? Now, one thing I love about this definition is it's all-inclusive, right? You even have spiritual or humanistic beliefs in there, which I find to be so great because, from my perspective, I would like the word interfaith to include so many traditions, so much diversity, that includes people who would consider themselves not to be a part of religion or not to necessarily have what we traditionally call a faith, right? So if you're an atheist or you're agnostic out there today and you're like, I don't think I'm a part of this. No, you're a part of this too, right? You're like, I don't want to be a part of this family. It's like, too bad, you are, This is how we're defining it, right? But this is a great hope for me for our future as individuals, our future as a community, and our future as a world, that we might be able to engage in this kind of dialogue, right? But how many of us growing up, the concept of interfaith was not even a concept for us, right? Or it was something that seemed foreign. It seemed maybe even we were taught that it was dangerous, right? Because this word, interfaith, can be used as an adjective for all kinds of things, right? Like in theory, you could have an interfaith marriage, interfaith friendship, an interfaith community. And yet for so many of us, we were never modeled what this could look like because we were never modeled what it might look like to be in relationship with people that we don't necessarily agree with on everything. But the Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says that interfaith dialogue doesn't mean that we have to agree on everything. It means we commit to a conversation, to listening, and to learning from one another. For me, my first personal introduction to any concept that relatively rang of this interfaith thing came in the form of a bumper sticker, okay? I think there are two kinds of people in this world, people who have bumper stickers on their car and people who don't. And when I was growing up, my first car, I put bumper stickers on. And then I think, if I remember correctly, I was going to go on a date, which was very uncommon for me. And I was like, immediately I was like, I need to get rid of these bumper stickers. And then I tried to get them off, and then they didn't come off, or they left a residue, and it was a whole thing. And so I decided never again, right? But we love you bumper sticker people, but I think that, that's just not who I am. But here's the reality. I, was exposed. I saw in my childhood begin to see this bumper sticker. How many of you are familiar with this, right? Now, what's so amazing about the coexist bumper sticker, and something that really I was reflecting on this week, is that it really rose to popularity after 9/11. A time in our culture, in our history, where there was this inclination towards divisiveness, fear of people, traditions, religions that we don't understand, right? So this time when things were swinging towards division, towards closing off, towards us and them mentality, out of that world arose this bumper sticker, an attempt to pull us out of that isolated mindset and to invite us into an interconnected mindset. Now, what I think is so beautiful about the idea of coexist is I think it doesn't even have to stop there. That really to coexist is actually pointing us towards something beyond coexistence, because personally, I don't want to simply coexist with my brothers and sisters of different traditions. I want to go beyond coexistence. And because when I think about purely coexisting, an image that comes to mind is that of a bento box. Now, I'll be real. This is one of my favorite meals on the planet, is a bento box. If you haven't encountered a bento box, it's a Japanese tradition, and basically each aspect of the meal sits in its own little slot, and it's this ensemble, but everything is sort of just coexisting without fully interacting. You understand? And I think that there's possibility for more for us as a people, as a society, right? That it's tasty, don't get me wrong. But I think when it comes to our spirituality, our interconnection as human beings, that we can move even further, that we can become more of a soup. Now it's feels like fall. I don't know if it's actually fall because the weather app seems to change all the time, but it feels like fall. And when fall hits, how many of us like to start making our soups, okay? I raise my hand as if I've ever made a soup in my life, but I mean... Exactly, I've eaten lots of soup, so I'm trying to put myself in other people's shoes, But something I love about soup, and something I've learned about soup, is that soup just gets better and better as time goes on. How many of us know that soup is better on day 3 and 4 than it is on day 1? Why is that? Because there is this coalescence of flavors, right? That the different component parts begin to dissolve into something beyond what they were as individual pieces, right? So maybe when we think about interfaith, we think not just coexisting side by side, but learning from one another, benefiting from one another, mixing and coalescing to such a degree that we begin to see the universality between all of our human experiences and how they come out in these respective faith traditions. But in order to experience that level of interconnection, what we need to be open to is the breaking down of our rigid boundaries that have so often existed between faith traditions. And this is going to require an entirely new way of approaching faith, identity, spirituality in the world, right? And in order to do that, I think it's important that for a moment we reflect on the old way. We reflect on what religion and faith meant to our ancestors in order to understand that if we want to forge a new path forward, we need to incorporate some of the things that were most valuable and integral to our ancestors, right? We can't just get rid of an old system without replacing some things that meant a lot to a lot of people. And when we think about the most central aspect of what faith, belonging, and religious traditions have meant to our ancestors and to many people in this world today is a sense of cohesion and community. See, for many people throughout the ages, religion was the only source of community available to them. Maybe growing up, you can even think of that. Maybe you grew up in a small town and everyone it was all connected through church, right? This is what it's represented in society, but it actually goes even further than that. It goes to the very building blocks of how we as humans developed into civilizations. The author Yuval Noah Harari is a historian who in 2011 wrote a pretty epic, dense book called Sapiens, which, if you've heard of it, it's basically this book about how Homo sapiens became the dominant species on planet Earth. And so he writes this real epic history about how that happens. And it's one of those books that's like, I don't know if you have any of these books on your bookshelf where it's so dense, it's so big, it has so much, wild mind-expanding ideas that you go around and if you're like me, you tell people that you've read it, but you've only read the first chapter. But it feels like it counts, The first chapter was about as intense as most books, so I'm like, I've read it, right? But he has this really incredible idea, and it's really this historically sound idea, which is that for humans to move from small hunter-gatherer groups, right? For humans to move from small tribes of belonging, right, which our evolution brought us to, and for us to evolve beyond that, what we came to was a sense of shared belief, shared religion, shared ideology, shared story, in order to get us to be able to exist in larger forms of community. So he puts it like this: religion enabled large numbers of strangers to cooperate effectively. But why should they do so? Why should an individual in a group of 100,000 people be willing to do things for the benefit of strangers? The answer is that large-scale human cooperation is based on our unique ability to believe in shared myths. This is the foundation of religions. This system establishes norms and values for cooperation and morality in human societies, which are crucial for keeping large groups together. Now, it's important to understand he is specifically talking about how things developed in the ancient world. So you might feel like this doesn't feel true for today anymore, and that makes sense, right? That's something we're going to explore today. But when we think about how we developed, right, how we moved from, and if you can't see, basically this is a group of people in a cave, right? This is like cavemen and cavewomen in a cave. And we, at a certain point in our trajectory as human beings, came out of the caves, came out of small groups, and somehow made our way to this, right? What a glow up. You know what I'm talking about? Like, what an incredible transition. And basically what Yuval Noah Harari is arguing is that this was made possible through shared myth, shared ideology, through shared faith in that which is unseen. Now, at this point, what makes it possible for a group of thousands of people to exist in something as populous and as filled with energy as Times Square, it might not be religion anymore. It might be the shared belief in something else unseen, something like the idea of America, right? We have these shared stories, these shared narratives that allow us to cooperate and form community on a level that is just simply not possible otherwise, right? Because imagine that many cavemen and cavewomen in that same amount of space. It seems like pandemonium, right? So there's something about human development that really, when we look at the role that these shared beliefs played, it allowed us to form community on a level that no other species has been able to do, right? But it's not just true in terms of human development, it is also true in terms of our own journeys. Because I know for many of us, especially those of us who might have grown up in a religious tradition, perhaps what it gave you or what you can remember as something central that it meant to you or meant to your family was a sense of community and a sense of belonging. For me, growing up in the evangelical Christian tradition, when I look back at my fondest memories, it was of community, it was of people, it was of mentors, it was of relationship, right? And we live in a world where perhaps it's harder than ever to meet people, to make friends, right? We're in the midst of such massive change, not only because of the pandemic, but as we look around, the ways that people found community for thousands of years, namely our religious institutions, are also in the midst of massive change and upheaval. And people across all dimensions of life and culture are trying to find ways to address this change. How many of us know that it's just hard to, for some of you, show up in a new city, in a new state, and imagine, how am I going to build community here? How am I going to make friends? It's not the way it was 50 and 100 years ago, right? And so we're in this time of great change. And we look back and we see how, yes, faith played this massive role socially and spiritually in helping to advance society to a point where community was available on a much larger scale than ever before. However, a problem arose, a problem that we still face today. And the problem is that in the creation of such community, there is still a form of tribalism. There is still exclusivity. That in order for some of us to feel like we are in, it also means that others are out. In order for there to be an us, there must be a them. And perhaps that aspect of faith has only become more pronounced as time has gone on. Which is why a community like ours, and specifically our community, we have this motto, love, period, as if to say that we are going to do our best attempt at breaking down any walls that we possibly can that create exclusion, right? That there's nothing that could limit you from belonging here. That the only thing that we need to agree on is the concept of love. And that isn't too hard, is it? And I reckon that's why you're here, friends, that you see the beauty in gathering, you see the beauty in community, right? Otherwise, you could be at home listening to a podcast or a TED Talk, but you're here because we find that there's such a powerful thing that happens when we gather, when we engage with spiritual growth together. But you probably are in a place like this because you couldn't do that elsewhere, right? You couldn't do it in a place that had this us or them mindset, that had the exclusivity of our way is the only way. And I understand this because this was my journey, right? I grew up in the Christian tradition. And when I think about what that was like, especially as it pertains to my perspective on other faiths growing up, I think about a food court. Hear me out. I think food courts are one of the best inventions of modern history, of our modern world, because, when else in history could you show up in a very small place and get any kind of cuisine you can imagine? It's an amazing thing. So I'm a big food court person. But as a metaphor, I think about my spiritual upbringing. And I think about it like a food court, because I was told that there was only one food stand that I was allowed to eat from at the food court. You guessed it. See, I'm just going to pull a random name out of the hat and just pick a restaurant at complete random. But I'll just say that the restaurant that I was allowed to eat from was Chick-fil-A. Totally random, picked completely randomly. But growing up, I was only allowed to eat at Chick-fil-A. And yet I would look around at the food court. I would see so many people in line at other food stations, looking healthy, looking happy, looking excited for what they were about to eat. But I was told that was not true food. The only true food was the food that I was eating, right? And yet I was just so confused because I saw people they would get their food and they looked like they were having a good old time, And eventually in my own journey, I had to walk over and I had to try the other foods, right? And maybe you relate to this part of your journey that spiritually you had to open yourself up to the reality that there could be beauty, there could be truth in traditions beyond what you were given perhaps as a child, right? And what I found when I began to explore other traditions, when I began this own interfaith part of my journey, I found that we are all much more similar than different. And this reality, the power of our similarities, far outweighing the weight of our differences, it felt like a truth that had been hidden from me, honestly. And it began to show me that in some ways, our traditions, right, the specifics, the uniqueness of our traditions, that's the exterior. That's like the packaging, right? But the core of each of these traditions had so much in common, right? Connecting to God, connecting to self, right? Love as the highest value. And it reminds me of this image from Rumi, the Sufi mystic, who says, the lamps are different, but the light is the same. There are a handful of other parables that explore this idea. There's the parable of the clay pots. Imagine a smattering of clay pots on the ocean side. They each have ocean water in them. Maybe each pot has a different texture, a different size, a different shape, but the water they contain is the same water, right? Or perhaps you have the mountain paths, right? That there are different paths up the mountain, but the destination is ultimately the same. I live nearby Sabino Canyon, and it's one of my favorite places to be. If you're maybe new to the area or you're watching online, Sabino Canyon is this wonderful, vast nature preserve that has many different hiking trails. And what I love about Sabino Canyon is that there are many options when you show up. There are many ways up the mountain. Some trails are more challenging if that's what you want. Some trails are easier if that's what you're looking for. Some trails have better views, right? Some are narrower, some are wider. And yet, most of the time, you end up in the same place. Or at the very least, you end up in a very similar type of place with a similar type of vantage point. And when I think about that approach, I think about the mystics, those who we would call the mystics, those like Rumi. Rumi was Sufi. Sufi is an Islamic tradition, but yet Rumi recognized the similarities are far more important than the differences. So the mystic perhaps is just like a hiker, one who can hold the specifics of your path loosely, right? You can appreciate the uniqueness of the path you're on, but you know that it is not the only way up the mountain, that it is not the only clay pot, that it is not the only food stand at the food court. There's a Jesuit theologian named Karl Rahner who he says this, and if you didn't grow up in the Christian tradition, right, then we'll kind of translate this language for all of us in just a second. But he says something really fascinating that I think has implications for all religion. He says the Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist at all. Now, to translate this into broader terms, we might say something like this. Religion as we've known it may either go away, which isn't as hard to imagine now than it was maybe 20, 30 years ago, right? Or it will be deeply interconnected. It will be populated by those who understand that the lamps are different, but the light is the same. Dr. King said that we may have all come on different ships, but we're in the same boat now. Interfaith dialogue helps us navigate the waters of our shared existence. Along those same lines, Archbishop Desmond Tutu said that my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. Interfaith dialogue helps us find this common humanity even amidst our differences. See, in a lot of ways, friends, this conversation is really a conversation about our shared humanity, right? Because as human beings, we are people of faith. Because life requires faith, and this has nothing to do with whether or not you are religious, right? Everything in life requires faith. Wi-Fi requires faith, okay? You plug the router in, and then you expect it to give you internet. You don't know how it works. That's fine, right? It requires faith, which I know for me is why when the Wi-Fi isn't working, I have an existential crisis. You have faith that when you go to Costco or Target that you're going to stick to your list, And I know many of us in Tucson, we have faith that the weather app is going to stay consistent, which is something I've completely lost faith in, right? But there's so many things in life that require faith. And when we think about our capital F faiths, right, the unique faiths that for so many of us have been a part of our identity, really these are just aspects of our orientation toward reality. How do we view life? How do we view what it is that we're doing here? And these unique aspects of ourselves are some of the best ways to understand each other through the uniqueness of our faiths. And this is going to require some open-mindedness, which in many ways is the ability to embrace perspectives and people that are outside of what is familiar to us. The Indian guru Swami Vivekananda, who lived in the 19th century, said, "If there is ever to be a universal religion, it would be one which embraces every aspect of humanity and recognizes every path to truth as valid." Now, I emboldened and underlined a couple of words as intentionally, every path to truth. And the reason I did that is because we need to be somewhat careful that it is not necessarily valid to say that every path leads to truth. That's not what is being said, right? Sometimes you hear people say every path leads up the mountain. Well, here's the reality, friends. Not every single possible path that we could take is going to get us to the same place, right? But what is said here is every path to truth, right? That there's some level of personal discernment that we need to have when thinking about what we're going to incorporate into our spirituality. The good news is that that discernment is up to us. We don't have to outsource that discernment to a pastor or to a book, right? We get to choose. And if you're wondering how it is that we can have such discernment, I want to turn to the words of Jesus, who gave us or who inspired us to this sense of personal responsibility. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 16 through 18, "But you will recognize them by their fruits. You don't find sweet, delicious grapes growing on thorny bushes, do you? You don't find delectable figs growing in the midst of prickly thistles. People and their lives are like trees. Good trees bear beautiful, tasty fruit, but bad trees bear ugly, bitter fruit. A good tree cannot bear ugly, bitter fruit, nor can a bad tree bear fruit that is beautiful and tasty." You might be really hungry after seeing that. And you might be like, why are we talking about fruit? Here's the reality, friends. The most basic way to break down what's being said here is that for so many of us, we were told, oh, that tree is bad, right? That source, that path is bad, without being given an explanation. And yet you see a lot of wonderful, meaningful lives coming from that path. In other words, you see what you were told was a bad tree, and yet the fruit is good. And what Jesus is saying is that if the fruit is good, the tree must be good. In other words, is this path producing lives of meaning? Is this path producing a good, positive, healthy way of being in the world? That is the fruit, what it produces. And what it produces is a direct reflection on the tree. In other words, how many of us found that something that we were told was a good tree could actually produce some bad fruit, right? And how many of us found the opposite to be true, that something we were told was a bad tree could produce some good fruit, right? I'm not talking about oranges, okay? I'm talking about on a much broader scale, right? We were given these narratives of these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, these are who we should trust, who we shouldn't trust. And yet we watched the fruit, we watched the human lives, and we saw something that challenged the way that we were taught, right? And so what does this all mean? I think it means that we have the opportunity and really the invitation to trust ourselves, to trust our intuition, to trust our instincts in this discernment process, that we as human beings, we have the ability to recognize good fruit. And so what is this going to take, right? Well, I think it's going to take some important qualities, the first of which is humility. Karen Armstrong says it like this: "No one faith has all the answers, but together we can learn to live harmoniously with respect and compassion for one another." It's the humility to say, I don't have all the answers. Perhaps my spiritual tradition doesn't have all the answers, but I can still live in harmony with my brothers and sisters. And in fact, maybe that level of humility can inspire curiosity, another very important value. That if you have the humility to recognize that I may not have all the answers, then maybe I'm curious about what other answers I can find from other traditions and other journeys and other experiences. This curiosity, I think, is what fuels so many of the conversations that happens at a community like this. And we ask questions like, hey, what can this other tradition teach me about life or God that I maybe have not experienced in my own? It was something that I found so much value in. I grew up in a tradition that only had this image and archetype of God as Father. And then when I began to explore other traditions, say the Hindu tradition, which has so many beautiful images of God as Mother, it expanded my own experience. Not to say that one is more valid than the other, but we can have both and allow that to give us a more nuanced picture of reality. And this humility leading to curiosity ultimately gives us a freedom to interact with what is out there, with what is available to us, and to take what benefits us, to eat the good fruit, right? From whatever tree it might come from, right? In a way, friends, now hear me out, but in a way, we have this opportunity to create a religion of our own. Now, I don't mean a religion that you would ever impose upon someone else, right? This isn't how to start a cult 101. I'm talking about the ability to create a religious or spiritual practice that you have designed for yourself based on your own unique makeup as a human being and as a soul, right? So maybe you pull some practices from over here and you pull some images and symbols from over there. And if you're wondering, how can I possibly trust myself to do that? Remember, you have the ultimate tool of discernment. If it bears fruit, the tree must be good. And what is all this doing in our lives? What is all this doing for humanity, for the evolution and development of humanity? What I think is happening is that we're seeing the expanding of circles of care and empathy and compassion in our hearts and in our communities. See, whether or not we realize it, all of our lives are dictated by the circles of compassion and care that we choose to draw around ourselves and around those we care about, right? So for some of us, it might be that my circle of empathy extends to my family, my extended family, my friends. Maybe it goes further than that, my local community, my spiritual community, and it can go on and on. But throughout all of history and today, we have these expanding circles, right, that they can either expand, right, or sometimes, as we see in times of turmoil and times of fear, they can contract. How many of us, this is why we look out during this election season and we feel so much chaos and tension, because there's all this expansion and contraction of our circles of empathy and care. And we're in a unique position as modern humans to have the widest circle of compassion that anyone has ever had in history because of technology, because of our awareness, right? That when we have compassion and care for what's going on in Ukraine or Gaza, our circle of compassion is expanding more than any humans who have come before, simply because they did not have the awareness of what was going on in the world that we have. So it's all about these expanding circles. And what's interesting is, if you were here a year ago, we had a series where we talked a little bit about what it might look like to reimagine church, and we broke down the word for church. And one potential root word for church is the Latin word kirche, which is where we get the word circle. So at its most basic, we might think of something like church as a circle that we draw for community, right? That the earliest forms of what we might call church or spiritual community, right, we look at our ancestors and the indigenous and the earliest forms of spiritual gathering, it was always a circle. So we look at what faith and spirituality has done for us over the long stretch of this human arc that we're on, right? It helped us expand our circles. It helped us move beyond just myself, my close tribe. It helped us move and expand and to include more people. But friends, I think we can keep on moving, right? To expand our circles beyond just our religion, beyond just our country, right? That maybe we might think of ourselves as children of the earth, or better yet, children of the cosmos. And if you and I are children of the cosmos, then who are our brothers and sisters? Who could possibly be left out of that equation? In that sense, this conversation about interfaith is really just the beginning, because it points to a greater way of being interconnected on every possible level. The theologian Ilia Delio, she says, the religion of tomorrow celebrates the idea that individuals can contribute to creating a sustainable and interconnected world, guided by love rather than rigid dogma. Maybe you don't even like the word religion, but just go with it for a second. If we want to see the religion of tomorrow, if we want to reach our interfaith future, then friends, we need to let go of our fear of change. We need to let go of our fear of that which we don't fully understand. Because for so many, institutionalized religion has, not only today, but throughout history, has given people the illusion of stability, the illusion of something unchanging in an ever-changing reality, right? But we have the opportunity to evolve beyond this fear, right? Because friends, this conversation, it was really never a conversation about religion. It was a conversation about faith. And what defines faith is a trust, is a surrender, not in knowing all the answers, but trusting. So friends, may you and I, may we be mystics, holding loosely our tradition while still appreciating what makes it special and what makes it unique. May we let go on our tight grip of being right so that we might learn and connect to the beautiful humans, the beautiful ideas, the beautiful stories from traditions outside of our own. And may we have a little faith that even as things change, that we are moving towards greater wholeness, greater unity, and greater connection. That is my hope for us, especially now, right?